Today's second panel will focus on the implications of the war for the global economy. The war poses serious questions about the future of Russian and Ukrainian economies, of course, first and foremost. But the war's wide-ranging global impacts have affected everything from fertilizer prices in Brazil, wheat prices in Africa, to energy costs here in the United States. One of the most important players in the United States, we were reminded last night by Bill Taylor, is the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, for whom the sanctions against Russia on technology, she feels is one of the key things that has helped the Ukrainians to win the war. We have 4 panels with us today to investigate all of these issues. Irina Rybakova is the chief economist at the Institute of International Finance, where she directs the IIF's economic research on emerging markets. Welcome. It's great to see you. John MacArthur is a senior fellow and the director for of the Center for Sustainable Development at my other alma mater, the Brookings Institution. John, welcome. It's great to have an opportunity to bring you down. Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, from another place where I spent some time, is a senior associate dean at the Yale School of Management, and he is the founder and CEO of the Chief Executive Leadership Institute. He and his colleagues have been doing extraordinary work tracking and engaging with companies that have either chosen to continue to do business in Russia or to get out. Andrei Kirilenko is a professor at the Cambridge Judge Business School and the founding director of the Cambridge Center for Finance Technology and Regulation. And they will be joined as discussants by Darden School of Business professors Yorgos Alianis, who teaches global finance and is the Robert Brunner Professor at the Darden School of Business, and Robert Brunner himself, who is the university professor, former dean of the Darden School of Business, and a senior fellow here at the Miller Center, where he leads our project on democracy and capitalism. And moderating our conversation is Scott Miller, a professor at the Darden School of Business and a research center here at the Miller Center, who directs the center on the project on democracy and capitalism. Bob, Scott, and Yorgos have been regular participants in our war room discussion, and when we talk about global economic issues, they've been leading the charge. So I'm going to turn it over to Scott. Thank you all, and thanks for first panel, and look forward to this panel.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bill. We have a wonderful first panel, and so thank you everybody for coming back. The way I'd like to just frame for 1 minute the conversation that we're having today, there's the famous quote from Sun Tzu, who said that wars are moral conflicts and they're won in the temples before they're ever fought. I found a perhaps dubious translation, but it works for my purposes. So I'm going to get them out of your pocket. Sure. Translation that may or may not be accurate. But that the translation said that they are wars of moral conflict and they're won in the marketplaces before they're ever fought, right? And so undergirding this entire ability to make war, make peace, is the ability to sustain the war and the society that undergirds it. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'd like to thank all my panelists for joining us here. I'd like to start with going to Andre, who is joining us from London. Thank you, Andre. Just to say, question is, how is the Ukrainian economy holding up at the moment? Obviously, we've heard about what Ukraine is able to do on the battlefield right now, but how is the Ukrainian economy functioning, and what are the key threats that it is facing at the moment?
We're not having sound, I'm not sure.
I can hear Andre. I think it's the room that they can't hear us.
Oh,
The room.
yeah,
Yes,
we got you, Andre.
I can hear Andre too.
Go ahead, Andre. We can hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, brilliant. First of all, thank you for having me as part of this panel. It's an honor. I would like to start by saying that, in my opinion, the Ukrainian economy is basically on life support. To give you an idea about the size of the Ukrainian economy relative to something that may be familiar to you, the pre-war GDP, that is the value created by the economy, was about $200 billion, give or take. This is about the annual GDP of the state of Kansas in the US. The population of Ukraine was on par with about the state of Texas. It was about, depending on how you count, about 35 plus million people. The size of Ukraine, of course, is also much, much larger than the state of Kansas. So it was an economy that it was a poor European country to begin with, without financial markets to speak of. It was a fairly conservative banking system. It was an open economy, meaning that it had about 70 to 80% of its GDP about where its exports and imports. It was trading with a number of partners, increasingly in the last several years, European Union and United Kingdom. So Ukrainian economy pre-war is a small, open economy populated by a large number of people who are effectively poor. So GDP per capita in Ukraine was something on par of $4,000 to $5,000. Heavily, of course, unequal, depending on where you live and in what you do. During the war, in the past several months, by some estimates, about 35 to 40% of the Ukrainian economy has been destroyed. It is in parts of Ukraine that are either under Russian occupation or in the war zone, or not operable. About 10 plus million people, by some estimates, and that is about a third of the population, left the country. They went either to the European Union or they went to Russia. So a third of the economy is destroyed, a third of the population is gone, and the overall sort of forecast of how much it's going to cost to rebuild it and restart it is about 2.5 to 3 times GDP of Ukraine. So in order to rebuild what has been destroyed and restart the economy, you need 3 pre-war GDPs. Prior to the war, Ukraine was not a popular destination for capital for a variety of reasons. Capital was flowing mostly out of Ukraine as opposed to into Ukraine. Into Ukraine, what was flowing was, a lot of it was remittances from people who work, Ukrainians who work outside of Ukraine, as opposed to private capital that would support the private enterprise. So that's what we're looking at. That's so it's a small open economy, poor with undeveloped capital markets that will need to be rebuilt. What happened during the war, and it's also heavily sort of administered. About 40% of the Ukrainian GDP was in some way related to the public sector in the form of revenues and expenditures. That's very high. So the government, in its very ineffective way, was heavily involved in the economy. So that's sort of the lay of the land, if you will. In order to rebuild this country, in my opinion, basically, a new financial infrastructure will need to be built in order for capital to flow into Ukraine and support the effort. If that does not happen, then millions of people will decide not to return. And once they decide not to return and make their lives elsewhere, it would be very difficult to to have them back, because with each passing day, week, a month, they're integrating elsewhere. Their hearts are in Ukraine, but their economic activity is elsewhere. There have been very interesting trends pre-war and during the war on how to do it, and I'll leave it perhaps for later discussion.
Perfect. Thank you, Andre. Just for the context for our audience here, Andre mentioning 30 or 40% GDP decline during the Great Depression in the United States over that entire period is we're talking 30% GDP decline. So we're talking the Great Depression compressed into about 9-10 months. It's a massive economic contraction. I'd like to go to Alina next. We're going to talk about sanctions in just a moment, but if we're to abstract out and look at the very top level in terms of kind of the macroeconomy, Alina, how is the Russian economy doing? Because there's been a lot of smoke on this issue, both in the press and also in the academy. So what is your assessment of the Russian economy at the moment?
Well, I think all of us, people sort of trying to support Ukraine's war effort and working on sanctions, we're really working hard to try to analyze the impact and also think what could be better measures to implement to undermine Russia's war effort. So in terms of the further measures that we were worried about that we'll need to do over autumn, I have to say that mobilization has been one of those wonderful sanctions that was self-imposed by Russian authorities. And I think they're almost as effective as a lot of measures. And I will start with, I would say, personal anecdote, apart from it's not funny, but, you know, I recently had a death in the family in the middle of nowhere in Russia. And the situation is such that there's nobody to dig the graves. Because in the smaller towns in Russia, the mobilization has been so severe that there isn't physically a person to go and dig out the grave. So this is where we are with mobilization, which is supposed to have been partial and also has stopped, and Putin has skirted the issues, but in reality it is continuing, and it's also basically getting all the possible able and disabled men bodies, trying to get them to the front. But in terms, so I think that will have a further additional impact on Russian economy apart from the sanctions. But if we talk about the sanctions, I want to break them down into a few chunks. One of them is energy sanctions, and this is Russia's gas and oil. And we need to be conscious that those sanctions haven't yet taken place. We haven't yet gone after the crown jewel of Russian exports, which is more than 50% energy, and also 40% of the government revenues is oil and gas. A big chunk of it is mostly oil. So we haven't yet sanctioned them. The sanctions, the embargo by the European Union is coming on board only on the 5th of December, and then oil products in February. And of course, it will be sort of matched with this oil price cap that we've been discussing so much. Of course, the gas side, Russia appears to have self-sanctioned itself. And again, European Union is moving away from gas. So this sort of the crown jewel hasn't been yet taken away. And therefore, we shouldn't be saying, well, sanctions are working or not working. We haven't yet aggressively sanctioned Russian energy, and Russia is mostly an energy exporter. The second part is financial sector industry. We have sanctioned more or less 2/3 of the Russian financial sector industry. So it's why the direct SDN lists by the US, sanctions by the European Union, de-swifting these banks. But at this stage in Russia, any bank is a government bank. Sort of any bank can receive a call from the authorities and say, look, we would like you to process certain transactions. And I know there is a lot of focus on Gazprom Bank, which has been left out, carved out, because it's mostly processes energy payments. But any other bank can be doing those payments, and any other bank can be accumulating foreign exchange on behalf of the Russian authorities or intervening on the market. So I think in the end, what needs to happen is that all of the Russian financial sector needs to go under sanctions with certain carve-outs for certain projects. Of course, we do not want to hurt humanitarian, for example, exports to Russia that would, or some certain medical products to Russia, and I think that's very important. The last point is on the export controls to Russia. We have seen a dramatic contraction in exports to Russia in the beginning of the sanction period in the second quarter, but since then, a lot of that has recovered. We have seen exports from Turkey to Russia go more than they were before the war. We have seen a pickup in errors and emissions on Turkish current account. So we have seen Chinese exports return to Russia to the previous level. And we also have seen some interesting transactions with other oil exporters where it appears that Russia is sort of shifting its oil and selling it via other countries. So again, some of the sanctions that maybe had a stronger bite in the beginning are beginning to wear off. And I think we need to continue focusing on the export controls as well. So the 3 points: energy is yet to come on board, further sanctioning of the financial sector, and then export controls. To sum it up, what's going to happen with Russian GDP this year? I think Russian authorities are going to report something between 3.5% and 4.5% of GDP. Of course, we're not going to believe those numbers because Russia's GDP has been has a long-standing history of being not a very strong number. But we do know that there is a double-digit contraction in industrial output, especially, of course, in particular dependent on the global value chains. We have seen, of course, the impact of sanctions and mobilization on consumption and business and consumer sentiment. And of course, that will continue to drag the economy down. But because of this the setting that I explained in the very beginning, we cannot just put our hands down and say, look, Russian economy is done. It is collapsing. It is absolutely undermined by the sanctions and cannot continue the war. I think, we need to continue with the sanctions, and we need to acknowledge that, yes, there are certain areas of the economy that indeed have been severely impacted, but sanctions are a moving target. Country learns how to adapt, learns how to avoid them, and we need to continue putting on the pressure. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Elena. On this subject of sanctions, I'd like to pass it over to Jeff Sonnenfeld, who's done some fantastically innovative work in this particular space, collecting data that may not otherwise be officially available. So, Jeff, how do you assess the sanctions regime? How is it working? And what can we expect in the near term? Oh, Jeff, I think.
Hold, yep.
Thanks so much. It's a great honor to join this distinguished panel. I have to say, just right from the outset, that the non-US participants may not be keenly aware of the late night comic Johnny Carson. Those who are from the US are, from the looks of it, almost all too young to remember who Johnny Carson was. Johnny Carson, who used to always warn new guests coming on to the Tonight Show, is never follow children or animal acts on stage. I take a look at the two who just preceded me, Alina and Andre, and who's yet to follow. It's such a galaxy of stars. It is intimidating. I agree with everything that Alina and Andre said. Small nuances. I'm a little bit more hopeful on the present sanctions regime. I'll explain why. But Alina is right, where there has to be some tightening for sure. And she was extremely diplomatic about what's coming in through Turkey, if anything else through Hungary too. We're seeing some real disturbing issues having to do with Aeroflot and S7 resuming near normal flight patterns. And for them to be certified as airworthy, they're getting parts in there that Boeing and Airbus tell us they're not selling them directly. But there's got to be a surge in something coming through the middleman of Turkey. But I haven't backed that up. And Alina, you're right to raise those kinds of things, that there are some slippages. And I think, of course, Andre, it is devastating. Of course, what's happening to this economy. I would point out one glimmer of hope in your otherwise tragically sober assessment of before, during, and the prospects for after, is that they are one of the world's largest grain producers. And as I know, we'll perhaps later in this panel want to take a look at the impact on global economy, perspective, horrors of famine with this historically bad drought, worse than our lifetime, worse than our parents' lifetime of water shortage in Africa. Ukraine is being unfairly blamed. But in fact, even with bad weather these last month and a half, there still is a bumper crop harvest coming into Ukraine. They already are easily one of the top 10 grain producers. They're producing, in a bad year, 40 to 45 million cubic metrics of grain. And they're past that now. I mean, they're already around 35 million cubic metrics, and we've still got, a fair bit of harvest yet to go. So there is some hope that there is something worth investing in there, aside from the devastation to all the capital infrastructure you've talked about, and food is more critical than ever right now. But I will say thank you on the something really important about sanctions is you see people on the left, people on the right, Marie Le Pen, of course, on the right, or old friends of mine like Paul Krugman and friends of many on this call, and others on the left, or maybe Fareed Zakaria, suggesting, oh, they never work. And we're seeing people wringing their hands about economic blockades that were didn't live up to expectations in Cuba or North Korea or Iran. And there's a reason why those handful of examples did not meet expectations. And there are patron saint companies that would bail them, countries that bail them out. Obviously, North Korea, were it not for China, would not be surviving right now. And sensitive moments in Cuba's history, the old Soviet Union bailed them out. But North Korea, with 95% of their trade, some say higher, is with China. So there are reasons why those didn't work. They weren't comprehensive across sectors. Selective sanctions, where you take a look at energy or automobile tires or whatever, selective sanctions, that never works. It has to be comprehensive across the economy, but it has to be comprehensive across countries. You can't have patron saints. But what's often missed, and we see right now, we had, I think, in stark evidence that people have forgotten what we learned from the economic sanctions matched with private sector pullouts in South Africa, is in the 1988, is those were 200 companies of led by General Motors, IBM, Coca-Cola, and others. And I never got to know Nelson Mandela, but I did get to know Bishop Desmond Tutu quite well. As thankful they were about the governmental sanctions, there were many symbolic as well as substantive paybacks for the private sector joining there is what made it so effective. And this is similarly, as some people on the call, especially the two panels who just preceded me, if Alina and Andre had the time, they would be able to tell you why it was in fact heavily produced by economic blockades in Poland with Jaruzelski's collapse. As Lech Walesa says, it all began in the shipyards, especially Gdansk and everything, but economic blockades in Poland, in Nicolae Ceausescu, of course in Romania. Despite all the cynics, Erich Honecker was a relatively bloodless transition. Of course, in East Germany, Pinochet, General Pinochet in Chile or in Argentina. Many people on this call know that Libya and Gaddafi was not a religious upsurge of Arab Spring. Those were other Gulf nations and things. But what happened in particular in Libya was heavily economic blockade. Frankly, Armand Hammer's death made it possible for Occidental to finally stop undercutting governmental sanctions. Is that when you have both independent private sector government pullout in companies with the government, it's very powerful. Substantively, it's massively powerful for unemployment and industrial parts and things, but also symbolically, when those Afrikaners in South Africa who had supported the apartheid regime saw that in fact they were truly being labeled as a pariah in the global community, that they were an outcast. And it wasn't just that they were the victims of governmental battles and things of diplomatic anger. It was actually something much larger, that they were, resented by the global community. That hit them much harder. So the symbolic and the substantive side really matter. I think it's having a devastating impact on Russia, despite some of the slippages that I agree with Alina have happened. We have seen that an unparalleled 1,000, almost 200, but easily 1,100 companies have pulled out. We graded them on an A to F scale. Some roughly 900 of them have pulled out completely. There are some that those are the A's and B's on our A to F scale. They pulled out completely and permanently, or pulled out completely and have suspended. The C's are in there in a partially have pulled out, and the D's are companies that are pretty much the same as the F's. We just had to legally recognize that they've said something about the war, and they have forestalled some vague, never before specified long-term investing that I think is quite specious and the product of clever public relations spin. We had to acknowledge them, but happily the A's, B's, and C's are massive, and they've had a big impact. We can account for, depending on how you tabulate it, almost 40% of the economy has hit the employment impact. And Putin said, oh, it's only 12% of direct employment. Right, 12% of direct employment. Every economist knows on this call, it's a minimum of 2 times and usually a 3 times multiple of the indirect employment. So that gets you right up there to a big portion of their workforce is hit. We've seen the massive flight of tech engineers to Tashkent, the Tashkent Industrial Park. Uzbekistan and neighboring countries have soared as a result of this critical talent. We've seen that every major industrial sector has fallen anywhere from 20 to 80%. Actually, now 95%. We took a look at automotive and some others have fallen as a result of this pullout of the companies. And the Putin propaganda has been falling flat. What he continually tries is to try to breed discontent and disunity. Some of his major, I think, miscues and were not just the strength of the Russian military isn't what he thought it was, and the surprising strength of the Ukrainian military and unexpected unified harmony, unified purpose in Ukraine, but that the West has hung together despite his propaganda. He was initially saying, well, I'm just going to pivot gas from the EU since we'll teach them a lesson. Well, 86% of his gas was going into the EU, but he said, I'm going to send it to Asia. He can't do that. Almost every economist we know, and few, including sadly probably a few on this call, were fooled by that. And most of the media was fooled by that. And the IMF was fooled by that. They didn't realize his gas is not fungible. Almost anybody on this call produces more LNG than he does. They don't have much in the way of LNG. It's all old-fashioned natural gas that's in the form of vapor that has to go through pipelines. And with the exception of one little creaky pipeline that could light up Hoboken for a couple of months, he doesn't have much that goes in, that taps into Asia. He can't pivot that gas. So most of that gas sits in the ground. While he needed it to sell to the EU didn't ever really need to buy it. At its peak, it was 43% of their energy, and now it's less than 9% of their gas is coming from Russia, and they could go to zero with very few consequences. Most of their gas now is coming from the U.S. in the form of LNG. Many industry analysts have gotten that wrong. Almost every energy analyst, in fact, every industry analyst has entered that space since LNG became a viable commercial industry. That's only since 2016. It's the technology as old as the turn of the last century, but only successful recently. That's much more easily shipped. Now, it was initially 10 times the price, so that had economic consequences. But just since the war has broken out, it's now only 5 times the price. So we can see it's having a great success. And on the oil front, Russia, sure, is the third largest producer of OPEC, but they're also overwhelmingly the least efficient. It cost them $46 a barrel to extract oil. The Saudis, with all U.S. technologies, only $22 a barrel to extract the oil, and they have to pay this huge discount to sell it to the few places that'll buy it. Russia and China, India and China have exacted a huge $35 a barrel discount. So they're making basically at break even. You add in the fact they have to ship it now an extra month plus to get it to Asia. They weren't making money. The fact that the Saudis have thrown their lot in with Russia to openly collude with them, because the Saudis did not need to do this, and especially in this tight market, they're making profits that Tiffany's would envy. They're making better than 80% profits. So this is a great concern. I'm most concerned right now, not so much what Russia can do, because all he has is empty propaganda. Russia is nothing but a feudal state in an old mercantile economy. They bring zero to the world. There's no reason for any company to go in there. They bring zero value added in any product other than cyber terrorism. There's nobody wants to buy. It's all food and fuel. But the Saudis are a huge problem.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. We're going to talk about the longer term implications of this economic disruption here in a moment, but right now I'd like to turn to John MacArthur, sitting right here across from me, to talk about the spillovers into the broader global economy. Obviously, we've heard that there are profound effects in Ukraine and also in Russia, but I have a little graph here that not everybody can see, but it essentially says that the demand for hedges against global economic contraction are going through the roof at the moment, much higher than they were even at the height of COVID. And so the markets are telling us that there is significant economic contraction on the horizon. And so I want to turn to John and say, what is the war in Russia or in Ukraine doing to the global economic structure more broadly?
Thank you so much. And building on the previous speaker's comments, I feel like the goal of these things is always not to be a warm-up act before the lead event. And or to be the warm-up act before, not to come after. So I'm very much following that theme. But I do want to thank everyone for joining and say that I think it's really, or for joining this conversation and allowing me to be here, because I do listen to this conversation as if we're talking a little bit too much of facts in isolation. I think it's really important to keep in mind there are at least 3 major conflicts underway around the world right now. I paraphrase them as one conflict over what's the consequences for breaking the rules of the international system. The second is a conflict over who gets to set the rules of the international system. And the third conflict is who gets left behind by the rules of the international system. The first, I think we heard some interesting points today on whether this is a single factor breaker of rules or whether there are multiple breakers of rules. And it is seen quite differently from outside the US than from inside the US. And I've worked in a previous incarnation at the United Nations during things like the Iraq War. And not to use a cheap crutch, but it is important to know how different things are heard than how they're said. And that is a through line of so much of this, because on the first 2 wars, there is a very real risk, in my view, of solipsism around our view as the view. I'm North American, at least I'm Canadian, but I've lived here for a long time. But there are many views to what's going on. And on the second, it's really a conflict between the US and China. This is profound, it's fundamental, it's in the news every day. The third, in my view, is a double conflict, actually. One is, as someone put it recently, we've been at the war with the planet for a long time. It's not working out so well. And the second is all the countries that get left behind as, get stompled in the grass as the elephants rumble above. This needs to be understood in terms of General Assembly votes on things like the war in Ukraine. Why don't more countries stand up against this? Well, many countries say, this is your fight. We just get the short end of the stick no matter what happens. There are many things going on at once that are very frequently oversimplified. We've talked about a global food price crisis this year, the price shocks around the world. There's no question there are some direct consequences of this for the global economy. The biggest ones in terms of price effects, natural gas and fertilizer. This is huge. This is probably 2 to 3x on baselines. And the latest data, I checked this last night, came out yesterday for the month of October. Natural gas is starting to come down dramatically, and there's some complex implications for the fertilizer industry. Some have cut back dramatically. Yara, major Norwegian-based producer, started to scale up. But these dynamics hurt the food industry globally. There are others. We hear a lot about wheat. Very simply, wheat is a temperate crop. Wheat is produced, it's either 2 major producers. There are some net wheat importers around the world that pay a consequence of this. But if you are a primarily rice-based grain society, there's been no effect in much of Asia, and the inflation is pretty much zero. Maize is a little more complicated. That's typically a sub-Saharan African corn, sub-Saharan African crop, where there is about a 2x change alongside wheat. But that is roughly the same as the price levels were in the early 2010s. It's been a jump, but by historical terms, it's not an unprecedented jump by any state. Oil is actually still within the realm of the past couple of decades. There was a price jump, but it's not as massive as it's often discussed in terms of the actual real effects. Now, who does this affect? Well, I mentioned wheat importer. If you're Indonesia, if you're Nigeria, if you're China, if you're Turkey, if you're Egypt, this is a real cost for your society. You import a lot of that food. If you're a fertilizer user, that might be whether you're in Iowa or Brazil or anywhere else. There are different types of fertilizer. There's diammonium phosphate, there's urea, which is ammonia-based. There's different ones, but this is a major issue. And a lot of places have cut back on fertilizer use because the prices have been so high. The poorest farmers in the world don't even use fertilizer to begin with. If you're a natural gas importer, big problem. This is really a Germany story in many ways. It's a Europe story for sure. I would differ slightly with one of the previous comments. Germany is going to spend about $200 billion supporting its domestic energy consumption costs. They recently announced for households and industries. They've said they'll spend up to that 200 billion euros, roughly dollars. This is a major expense for them. What we're also seeing is the global development cooperation budgets are being hit. Global foreign aid budgets, if you add them all up around the world, it's about 150 billion a year. About a third of that this year is going to, about 50 billion will go to refugee resettlement costs. When a country welcomes refugees and they spend the dollars in their own country, that's considered foreign aid. The numbers differ, but there's probably more than 7 million refugees. Germany, again, is going to spend, so the overall, it's about 50 billion of the 150 billion is being redirected to these refugees. There are other sources of refugees too, but it's a huge consequence. Germany is spending more than half of its development budget on refugees as a major host of these. It's a huge consequence because Germany is also one of the biggest investors in global development now. Underneath this, there's geopolitical risk, which is a huge consequence of just the elephants rumbling. The Fed put out a nice paper earlier this year, but just showing roughly how much this conflict might matter through geopolitical risk, which is also China risk and the Taiwan questions and all the things that so many of us worry about. But for sense of scale, it's maybe 1% change on world inflation. It's maybe 1.5% decline on world GDP. It's maybe a 15% increase on the price of oil and maybe a 5 to 10% drop on stock markets. These are material, but they're not everything. Now, there might be some positive tweaks here or structural changes coming out, like on the energy transition. So the shift to renewables, as some people say, Vladimir Putin might have inadvertently fast-tracked the transition to renewable energy, especially in Europe, and reinvigorated things like nuclear. The bigger consequences, though, we have a climate summit coming up in Egypt next week, which is in a really tough spot because of this third conflict of developing countries in particular getting overlooked. Bottom line, we cannot solve the global climate process or challenge unless developing country perspectives on what they need are understood, because they will be the fulcrum of global carbon emissions. The advanced economies promised $100 billion a year in 2009 to support developing countries with climate. They have by 2020, and we haven't even reached that by 2022. And maybe by 2025. And by the way, the true needs of investment are $1 trillion a year in a 100 trillion global economy. We can spend $200 billion in one country or 50 or hundreds of billion dollars in another country on this broader conflict, which is kind of not our doing from the perspective of developing countries. There's a real fatigue that's setting in our geopolitics around emerging economies that are going to determine the world's future on many, many issues, but are treated as object, not subject of these conversations. And so I do think we need to understand, it's for the next panel too, the depth of reinvigoration of multilateral cooperation that is not solipsistic, but takes a much broader range of perspectives in order to solve even the allyship that is needed on the most decisive conflict of the front lines. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, John. I'd just like to open it up now to the group. This idea that this global economic and financial instability can work in type of a symbiotic cycle with what's going on in Russia and Ukraine at the moment. So I'd like to open it to anybody here in the group, but what are some of the longer term threats that we need to be aware of, whether that be specifically in Russia and Ukraine or in the broader macro economy, as we kind of look out beyond the 1 or 2 year horizon and out towards the broader future? Yeah, Yorgos.
I'll take some. May I, since I have the microphone, can I comment on some of the things that came before us, which is fascinating. Just one general thing is, speaking of capital markets, I look to, and I teach financial institutions, I look into the prices and the stock prices of financial institutions many times, just assuming, of course, that markets tell us something about the future. That's not always the case. And, it would be, not the case for Russia. But if you look at, the major, perhaps, Russian bank, Sberbank. So, I mean, it went down, the stock price of Sberbank went down to almost zero at some point. Now it's about 127 for my last count. So it's the lowest, the highest was 350. So what does that mean? Well, I think Russia keeps propping the banks like what we did, 15 years ago or 13 years ago here. So in essence, when you would expect a collapse of Russia is, you would expect a collapse of the banks, but Russia still has the means, it looks like, they can print rubles. And speaking of rubles, this is, although I cannot trade Sberbank, so global traders cannot get into Sberbank stock, but they could trade ruble. And the ruble, if you see it, it had a huge decline and then it went just back up. And of course, the question is, what does that mean? Well, so far it looks like what Russia does, both on the the central bank supporting the ruble and Russia supporting its banks, seems to be. I'm not denying all the economic issues of firms pulling out, etc. But just looking at some indicators on the currency front, on the bank front, doesn't seem that we're going to have a very, speedy collapse of Russia. Especially, this was actually my question to Eric. I will call him in the war room last week. Is when we see actually countries that facilitate the evasion of the sanctions, and so. I wrote a piece in May saying sanctions are unprecedented, the ones that we've imposed, but they're not going to end the war. And I continue to believe that, unfortunately. And part of it is that sanctions have two effects. One is that they can be evaded, and who would have thought that they would be evaded by an ally and other countries that are neutral or not. And the other thing about sanctions is that they also make people inside the country feel more patriotic in a weird way, and basically make the war against them feel like it's the war of the West against us. So it becomes something totally different. And so I would challenge people to tell me when sanctions really worked. So I'm with Fareed Zakari on this. And I will end with something about the Global South, which I think is also fascinating. Having traveled quite a bit for my previous job as Associate Dean of the Global Program at Darden, the rest of the world doesn't see it exactly the same way, or some of the rest of the world, like Africa and South America and others, and that's kind of sad. But one of the things that actually is becoming very devastating for them is the dollar. And what happened was clearly we had to raise interest rates in this country because we wanted to beat inflation that perhaps the war definitely exacerbated the issue. And with the dollar becoming so strong, and you got a lot of economies that have a lot of foreign debt, you can imagine now it takes a lot more pesos to pay the same amount of debt in dollars, if that. So that I think is going to be a big issue going forward. And now the dollar has declined a little bit, but in any event, that's not going to be seen well by the rest of the world. having a strong dollar. So I'll stop here. And I know, Scott, I didn't answer your questions. So yeah, I'll do expect a global crisis or a global. I mean, it looks like yeah, Europe is going to have a tough time next year.
Yeah.
I'd love to jump in if I could, just to very briefly correct what I think are some very, 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 very dangerous statements just said. In Foreign Policy Magazine, we published a list. I won't take you, you'd look it up yourself, 50 examples where economic blockades have worked that counter the handful where they were disappointing. And we don't have time to enumerate them. I mentioned several of them before. I please want to direct anybody who just heard that last speaker to take a look at that massive, and we also have 200-page descriptions of these countries to show how they worked cross-sector. It's quite powerful, but please look at the Foreign Policy Magazine and you'll find why Fareed now Zakaria acknowledges he was wrong. And I hope the prior speaker and others do recognize that. Secondly, please, anybody on this call, stop falling victim, as briefly the IMF did, and the prior speaker just did, to Putin's propaganda. It's completely wrong. You can't quote the ruble. It's an untraded currency. The prior speaker, no matter what economics training you have, you must know you can't talk about a freely traded currency if it's not. Putin wakes up in the morning and by fiat and defines a price for the ruble. If you look right this second, punch up the black market on the ruble, it's 200% down traded on what Putin's trying to command as the ruble price. The ruble's not traded. And you can't talk about trading the stock price of Sberbank or anything on the Russian market. Nobody on this call, nobody you know in your lifetime will be able to sell a Russian stock. There are currency controls. You can't sell out of the market. So that's ludicrous. And the GDP, as the IMF now recognizes, is a completely invented number by Putin. Everybody on this call must know that to be a member of the IMF, you have to submit certain information. Putin has concealed that information. And we have this on our SSRN site. Look it up. And you can see that imports, exports, foreign direct investment, the performance of financial institutions, air travel volume, we recalculated this. Wherever Russia's the buyer, we went to the seller. Wherever Russia's the seller, we went to the buyer. The Russian economy is not resurgent. That is completely false. Everything you just heard is 100% wrong. Very
well, I like some controversy, but let me say one thing.
Russia's economy is not resurgent. Russia's economy is failing. And what's important to understand is what are the facts? Not just because Putin says it so. What are those facts? And the facts show this economy is imploding. We do have.
Will this end the war, Jeffrey?
In terms of
will this end the war?
John MacArthur's prior comments, Harry Truman, as president, famously said, "I'd like to have a one-armed economist because it's always on one hand, on the other hand." In this case, Harry Truman would ask for a two-armed economist. What you heard from John MacArthur was a very interesting assessment of on one hand. But how about the other hand? How about if we were to just go for appeasement? What does that do to the world economy? Already Putin has said he doesn't recognize the sovereignty of the Baltic nations, as Elena knows. What does that mean as we see this imperialistic, bloody autocrat take over more of the world? What would that mean if we were to concede energy markets and everything else to Putin? No.
Jeff, I'd like to, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we are running down the clock, and I would like to turn it over to Bob Bruner, who is looking to make some comments here because Bob is our distinguished colleague here at UVA and had some comments to make. Bob?
You all should know that Jeff Sonnenfeld and I have been friends and classmates for years and years. He and I were in doctoral studies together at Harvard, those many years ago, and I learned it's not only his Johnny Carson comment, don't follow children and animals, don't follow Jeff Sonnenfeld. But I adore his candor, and nothing makes a university gathering more worthwhile than to hear a diversity of views. Let's understand that we've seen that in this session. We saw it in the prior session. We should hear such diversity in sessions to come. That's what we try to achieve in these Ukraine war rooms each week. I'd like to turn the conversation to the sense of crisis. I would agree with Andre that Ukraine is on life support. This is a financial crisis in the making, in slow motion. It is a train wreck happening before our eyes. Ukraine has fixed the hryvnia, the exchange rate. It is spending central bank reserves at an amazing rate, faster than Ukraine is receiving international support. Sooner or later, it's going to run out of reserves. There have already been some spectacular for Ukraine bankruptcies, and the state-owned gas utility Naftogaz defaulted in July, 335 million in debt issue, not big relative to US markets, but huge relative to Ukraine. What we should worry about here in our comfort in the United States and in other developed economies is from a geopolitical standpoint, if we want to help Ukraine, how do we fund this this bloodletting, this financial bloodletting in Ukraine? And secondly, how might the crisis, the train wreck in slow motion, spread? So contagion is a feature of all the big financial crises of history, and history shows that crises begin not in the center, not typically at the core strength of national or global economies, but in the periphery. Ukraine, as all of our speakers today have suggested, Ukraine occupies the periphery of the global economy, and yet the way this crisis is unfolding could spread to certainly to Europe, which is feeling a great deal of pain presently, possibly to some of the food risk countries that we've mentioned in the session so far. Certainly, Russia's going to feel pain. I would agree with Jeffrey that we don't know what Russia's condition is because of the very tightly managed financial results that are being published today. But it can't be good. It can't be sustainable on Russia's part. So how do these ripples spread to the rest of the world? And we should beware of over-optimism. It's a feature of conditions that precede widening crises of what I'd call overshooting. So participants in markets believe that, well, we're doing fine now, these conditions will prevail inexorably into the future, and decision makers make large and expensive decisions based on that supposition, and then suddenly realize, oops, conditions have changed. There are measures of optimism and risk tolerance, risk aversion that we should pay attention to as well. I'm not saying that I am saying that I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not saying that a crisis is imminent here in the US or in the developed economies, but we should be very, very careful to attend to the ripple effects of the crisis in this small, poor country, well around the world from where the United States is. And what do we do in a crisis? You feed the beast. You flood it with liquidity. You provide the funds that sustain the economy, and then deal with the cost of that liquidity afterwards. But it's going to take a very, very substantial political commitment on the part of the United States and the other developed economies to pay that bill when it comes due. I would agree with Yorgos, and I think with Jeffrey. I think the United States should step up and be prepared to pay the bill.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bob. I'm going to turn it over to our War Room colleague, Dale Copeland, for a quick comment as we're rounding the corner here toward the finish line. So, Dale.
Well, maybe this is good for the next panel as well, but I want to move us away from just a linear causal way of thinking, that this affects this affects this, and move us back to something the great late Bob Jervis said 25 years ago about system effects, of more of a circular causality where things can happen inadvertently. We sometimes call it butterfly effects or complexity. But what we've seen in the last, 8 months is really a great example of Jervis's way of thinking, namely that political threats that come about, such as an invasion of Ukraine, can have economic changes in the economic threats that people make. And those economic threats then change the political threats, and you get that circular spiral effect that he's so famous for. But let me just give you a couple examples to think about rather than trying to tell you a full story here. One obvious thing is, well, this attack in February consolidated the view that there's an authoritarian threat, a bloc, China and Russia, trying to push out. And that, of course, has had economic effects for both China and the US. The Chinese one was, we can't use the land routes to sell our goods to Europe anymore. And Europe, EU is our largest market. So we have to go the maritime route, but that means we have to support our Navy more. And that naval support makes it look like China's the bigger threat. And I think they are a threat. But of course, what are we doing in response? Well, we're upping the ante over, both sides upping the ante over Taiwan. And then, of course, the new chip sanctions that have come out in early October have considerably increase the China sense of threat to the world economy. They are doing things to adjust, decoupling and so forth at the high tech level. And those have ripple effects that then increase political threats. And the cycle goes back and forth. And you get what we often call a spiral into a Cold War. But this case, an economic Cold War, as well as perhaps a political one, and hopefully not a military one, right? But all of these things self-reinforce. And I'm just pushing an area of economics that I don't know a lot about, but I know it's on the forefront of economics, which is complexity theory economics, where you have these interesting inadvertent spiraling effects that were unanticipated when it first started. And the butterfly, of course, causing a tornado. But in this case, what we've seen is an incredible spiraling of tension, all related to one act, the act of moving into Ukraine. And the ripple effects, again, spiral effects from economy to political and back to economy are very important here.
Thank you, Dale. Yes, we're obviously seeing the beginning and in the middle of this kind of global cycle that is very difficult to understand where it will end. But I want to go back to Andre and Elena to see where this leaves Ukraine, right? Because they are the locus of this particular symposium and this particular crisis. And I want to talk to Andre first and then Elena. What does Ukraine need in order to sustain itself and to remain viable? Obviously, there are a lot of variables, but what can the West do, and what do we need to make sure that Ukraine can make it out of this?
Thank you for this, and thank you to all the previous speakers for their views. With US and UK behind Ukraine, Ukraine will win this war. What that means is not entirely clear. Winning the war. Let's say that winning the war from the part of the Ukrainians means that Russians pull out of Ukraine, out of territorial borders of Ukraine. That does not necessarily mean that Russia will lose the war, because it will remain a threat, because it could attack various parts of Ukraine from within its territory going forward. So for Ukraine to continue going, first it will need to squeeze the Russians out of its territory, and then it will need to join a either NATO directly or NATO-like alliance in order to build basically a security shield around it. Ukraine going forward, to me, looks increasingly like a poor country with a very advanced military. It will be a country which will have to support advanced, large military forces. It will be a heavily militarized society, simply because if it doesn't do that, it will not survive. That means that the Ukrainian economy will need to support this effort. That also means that the significant part of the Ukrainian society will need to support this effort, which is already happening. Some parallels to what this story is going to look like and how it's going to unfold is not dissimilar to the Israeli-Arab conflict in the 1970s. It will take a long time, and at some point, both sides, Russia and Ukraine, will be at the point where they cannot fight anymore. Sanctions will castrate Russia, and it will not have the ability to sustain the effort, and the war will basically, lead to a point in Ukraine where everything that it has, it's already using to defend itself and push Russians out of its borders. That's where I see this happening. That's where I sort of see happening. This conflict, just to remind everyone, has been going on for a long time and will continue going for a long time. Ukrainians are increasingly aware that elections have consequences. The choices that they made before, which many political analysts within Ukraine quote and call outright irresponsible, they realize that what the choices they made within their democratic and political system, within their economic system, within their governance system. They understand how important it is to make choices that are more responsible, but they're watching US midterm elections because the budgetary consequences and therefore support for Ukraine will depend upon how those elections fall. So that's where I see these things going. With the US and UK behind Ukraine, it will win. There is no question in my mind. Will the support continue? Most likely, yes, for a variety of reasons. Will this support fluctuate in time? Yes. Will the Ukrainian central bank and other donors and partners would need to be able to support it during the times when other donors are not able to? Yes, absolutely. But it will be a long conflict, and it will lead to, in some way, a stalemate after which things will need to be rebuilt.
All right, thank you, Andre. We could go on with this discussion for hours and hours and hours, but unfortunately we are out of time. So I would like to, John, a short statement to conclude.
Just very quickly, sorry. No, I think I just very quickly to summarize. So on Ukraine, I think it's key to have this solid macroeconomic framework, and one of the panelists talk about that. I think there is an issue, they need more cash support. That's very clear. I think where they're not getting it, we're sitting here looking at the news, we're looking at the wins at the war, and I think Andrei explained it very quickly and very clearly. They are intervening, and I think towards the end of the year, they probably have enough reserves, but next year we might have a proper balance of payments prices in addition to the war. And this is not about reconstruction in the future, it's what's happening now. So I think that's first. On the second one, I think it's fantastic that we're having this lively debate about, about the impact on Russia. But I think either extreme is too dangerous, and there is importance of nuance. If we say Russia is truly collapsing, then we can say, well, we'll rest on our laurels and we do not need more sanctions. If we say sanctions are not working, then we could say, well, the pain is too much to us versus them. Again, we do not need more sanctions. But I think the debate is much more nuanced than that. And we can do more. It's having an impact, but we shouldn't sort of think that sanctions are not a moving target. And then finally, on the other countries, I was talking to the chief economist of the African, one of the African banks, and they're saying, look, what about us? You demand from us to comply within this global trade wars, but you forget that for us, the crisis in food, crisis in energy is even more painful, and we have many more people below the poverty line. And you expect us to get involved in this conflict with sanctions while you're not paying attention to us when we're having a problem. And I will stop with that. Thank you.
Just as a very quick 30 seconds, if I could.
I'm sorry, Jeff. I'm so sorry. I apologize, but we are already significantly over time.
I agree
So
with
I'd
that.
like to, I recommend for everybody to follow all of these scholars' work. But for now, we are over our allowance of time. So thank you to all of our panelists. We will be back, Bill, in 7 minutes for our next session. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you.